Good afternoon, everybody. I'm just briefly going to introduce myself before I introduce the rest of the panel. But before I do that, if anybody knows Mike Barrington, can you grab him and bring him up here, because he should be here. Mike Barrington, where are you? He's gone to the toilet, has he? Lovely. Okay, my name is Bob Lawrence. 30 years ago, I went under the name of Richard Thompson. The people who are sitting alongside me knew me as Busby. You may or may not recall those days. I hope you do, because that's the whole bloody point of us being here this afternoon. We're looking back at the last days of the radio ship Mi Amigo. The last years, of the radio ship Mi Amigo. I got involved in, well, my first trip to the ship was in August of 1978. And I was there until the old lady went in March of 1980. If I can just quickly whiz along, let's start this side. Do you want to share a mic? What's your name, and when did you join Radio Caroline?
My name is Stuart Russel.
Yeah.
Well, it was. And I joined in 1976.
And I think you hold the record for being the longest person involved with Caroline, because you're still involved with Caroline's... Well, Peter's not involved with the satellite, though, is he?
No, that's true, no. Could be if he wants to.
You've been around all that time.
Yes.
This bloke needs no introduction whatsoever, but he very rarely speaks on a microphone, so let's make him. Who are you?
Well, my name is Peter. Peter Chicago is the name that most people here would know me by. And, of course, I've been involved with Caroline from the time we first got the Mi Amigo back to sea again, which I think was 1973. And it's been fun, it's been exciting, and up and down, lots and lots of stories, of course. So that's me.
And this fella here?
I'm Roger Mathews. I joined in 76, shortly after Stuart Russel, and hung around the station for a few years. Still on the station now.
And finally?
Yes, I'm Martin Fisher.
You had to think about that,
I had
didn't
to
you?
think about it. I sort of first joined, it was around Christmas time of 1976, but actually was on the Mi Amigo very early 1977. I stayed with the Mi Amigo for almost 3 years, and I'm still involved with the current satellite service.
The idea of us being here is really for you to meet us, and if you've got any questions that you've been holding on to for 30-odd years, feel free to ask. My guess is that Peter Chicago is probably going to be very busy answering questions, but it might be worth remembering that Martin Fisher was also a technician on the radio ship, so if you have got any questions about transponders, no, they didn't have transponders, were they? Transistors and diodes and valves, yes, feel free. There are two groups. This is the first group. In the second group, we're focusing on the very end. This is the sort of 1977 period. And Barrington, you need to come up here. Thank you. Mike was also a technical bod once or twice on the Mi Amigo when he wasn't sleeping. Right, so any questions at all for anybody sitting up here at the table? No. Well, thank you very much. It's been fantastic.
See you next year.
Just for the benefit of internet listeners, because the audience isn't mic'd up, the question to the panel is, can we elaborate on the music format that we used in the latter days of the Mi Amigo? Who wants to answer that question?
Well, I'll give it a go then. When it's 76, when I joined, it was very much play what you liked. It was very free form. It wasn't playlisted, no such thing. There's a record library. Anything in the record library could be played, and that's the way we did it. Towards the end, I think it's late 77, 78, we did have a format. We never playlisted the station, but we did have a sort of format, a little set of boxes, so that we distributed the music evenly across all the programs. So there was never actually a playlist. You were never told you had to play this or play that. But basically, the boxes would be for each hour, you'd say you'd have one or two classic tracks, a new track, sort of just a standard general album track. But it was all based on album tracks, which to us gave us an advantage at the time, because rather than the stations on land who had a playlist and would play the singles when they came out, we get the album and play them all first off. So we felt that was a bit of an advantage. But we were never actually playlisted, were we?
No.
That was the closest we came to a format, this little system of boxes.
And it worked perfectly because, as I always bore people to death with, the advantage that I think all of us have over many radio people is that we all listened to Radio Caroline before we got involved. So by the time we got involved, we all knew what Radio Caroline was inside out. And as a listener to Radio Caroline, the thing that I loved was if I listened to Johnny Jason, I knew that Johnny Jason would play a lot of white soul and black soul with some rock music in there. He had his own musical identity. If I listened to Tony, God rest his soul, we'd get, Demis Roussos and the Carpenters, followed by Deep Purple or the Stylistics or whatever. Andy Archer. All these people had their own musical identity, but it all fitted into the Caroline umbrella. And that continued, I like to think, during the days that I was involved with Caroline. Martin Fisher had his own musical style, but it sounded like Caroline. Stuart Russell had his own style, but it sounded like Caroline, and so on and so forth. And as Roger's just said, there was a loose format, and the format, in case you're wondering, the format was important for the very reason that I've just said. A listener has to know what he's going to get from the radio station, unless you are running a free-form, eclectic station, which Caroline never was.
Yeah, I think generally we were... people have always come out with this thing that it was a rock station. I don't think it ever was a rock station. It was an album station. And therefore we'd play everything from the Leslie Brothers to Deep Purple to Led Zeppelin, Frank Zappa. It was on an album, we'd play it, basically. There was no restriction. And the format system we had didn't stop you playing anything. It just made sure you didn't play all the same kind of music for the whole hour. It made you just spread it out a bit, that was all.
I'd say, actually, it made us play new albums as well as the old ones, so it had that effect. But it was a huge amount of freedom within that, as Roger and Busby's just been saying.
Any other questions?
Nothing?
Any other questions about those days?
This is the great Peter Chicago. This is the man who last year won the award, was it Anorak of the Century or something? What was your award?
It was an award, I think, for engineering services to the offshore radio movement over the years. I can't remember exactly how the award was worded, but it was certainly for the engineering services that I performed.
Question here. A story about the technical problems.
There are so many. I suppose the biggest challenge really occurred soon after we got the ship back out to sea, because we were lucky enough that the installation was already in place, and we thought and hoped at the time it was just a question of getting the transmitters put back together again, parts that had been taken, replaced. And it should have been that simple, but we didn't have the money to do the maintenance on the mast that should have been done. And before we were able to catch up and earn some money and get that work done, we lost the mast during a storm and immediately had the huge problem of trying to get a workable aerial on the ship. And that was the beginning of all sorts of experimentation. We found companies that were confident they could build a 50-metre mast, and it was no problem. They were building these masts all the time, and they'd come out to the boat and they'd start off all right, burning a few holes in the metal plating here and there to put wires on. But of course, as soon as they got more than about 10 or 15 metres up in the air, suddenly the angles on the wires were all wrong, and the masts weren't properly designed, and they began to buckle. We had what we called the Mickey Mouse mast, which when you looked up at it from the deck, it was like a double S. It was curving all over the place. And they built it to about 20 metres in height, and it was already looking terrible. And they admitted that was as far as they dare go. And so we just had to try and use that, which we did for a while, and it worked quite well. But that was the challenge in the beginning, to get a decent mast once we'd lost the original mast that had been fitted during the 1960s. And it was all a learning process, because the people out on the boat, most of them hadn't really done anything like this before. So we were all finding out the hard way what worked and what didn't work. And, the most surprising people would have talents that we didn't expect. We'd hire somebody as a cook, and they'd turn out to be an excellent climber, and they'd be actually going up to the top of the mast and keeping us on the air that way. It's difficult to think of any specific stories, but there were just so many crazy things that we did and that we got away with. I mean, we were just very, very lucky.
Well, can I ask you a question? The mast that was there when I arrived, which was the one still on the boat when it eventually sank, when was that actually put up, and who put that one up?
We'd had a fairly successful mast, which was built in Belgium, and it was 50 meters high, and it worked very, very well. But sadly, it only lasted a few months. And suddenly we were back to the same old problem. We had no mast. And then some of the Dutch disc jockeys that were working on the boat told us that Adrian van Lanschot had a mast built for his ship, and it was there in Scheveningen at a company that mostly built garden gates and ornamental railings and things. And originally, when we heard about it, we joked about it. Radio Atlantis is having a mast built, and is built by a company that make garage doors. Anyway, I went to take a look at the mast, and it was very well built, and I was impressed by it. But it just looked very, very heavy, and I thought it was too heavy to put on the Mi Amigo. And having looked at it, we sort of went away and probably decided that it just wouldn't work. And anyway, this mast was for Radio Atlantis, and as far as we knew, that's where it was going. Well, we got a telephone call from the owner of the company. Radio Atlantis hadn't paid him for the work on the mast. His company was in difficulty. He needed to sell the mast. He knew that we still needed a mast. And the various problems that I'd had with his construction, he was talking to me. He was, we can do this and we can do that. And, don't worry, we can fix it. But do you want the mast? Well, we said yes. And it was a very, very good, very well-built mast. I mean, so strong that even after the ship went down, it was still there, visible, and marked on shipping charts. It was there for several years afterwards. That really was where we got lucky, and it was a superb mast.
I have got a question. In 1976, you began using a second medium wave transmitter to put Caroline on the air during the day. Was it a problem to put two transmitters on the single mast? And which audience did you reach with the second, weaker transmitter?
Well, from the beginning, the English people involved anyway wanted an English radio station. It was really why we got involved with the project. But of course, we needed to make money, and to make money, we had the Dutch programs. So always there was this tension, if you like, between the English people on board who just wanted an English radio station and the Dutch people who knew that they were doing the programs that actually put the food on the table. So we tried to make the best of both worlds by opening up a second service. And the first time that we made this work, we used an aerial which was rigged to a back mast on the ship. And it worked quite well without any special filters between the two different sets of equipment. Later on, we had rather more complicated arrangements where we actually had tuned filters on each of the antenna systems, effectively isolating one transmitter from the other. But the first time we tried it, and the first time we actually made the idea work, we just really relied upon the separation of the two feed points, one being fed at one end of the ship and the other antenna being fed from the other end of the ship, and just the matching networks to each transmitter, and the fact that the frequencies were so different allowed us to do it in a fairly simple way.
What kind of antenna was that?
Generally, we used, I suppose, what these days you would call an inverted L. It was a short vertical with a more or less horizontal top section. I mean, there were different times. If we had, at the time, a decent mast in the front of the ship, then, of course, we were able to use that as a support for the second antenna as well. But we had so many different antennas on the Mi Amigo until we finally got the mast that stayed with the ship until the end. It was a building process, really. We were trying to improve on what we had and gradually sort of taking steps forward until eventually we got back, if you like, to the situation we'd started with, which was a ship with a decent-sized mast mounted on the front of the ship, and ultimately with the filters that enabled us to feed that mast at 2 different frequencies. Is there? It's an amusing story that probably I've forgotten over the years. But we were lucky because with the 2 Caroline ships, there was a lot of transmission equipment. And when we bought the Mi Amigo, we were able to buy the components and parts from the transmitters that were on the Radio Caroline North ship. So we were lucky enough to have quite a good collection of professionally wound inductors, and it gave us the building blocks to actually build these diplexers. I think perhaps the question refers to my first misguided attempt to put 2 transmitters on from one ship, and that was when I was still with Radio Noordzee. And again, it was a Dutch radio station, but there were English people on board that wanted an English radio station. And we had another transmitter. It was the transmitter which I think came from Radio 390. It was their 10 kilowatt transmitter that we had on the ship. And it was still tuned to the Radio 390 frequency. So I thought all I need do is put up a separate aerial tuned to that frequency, use one of the feeder cables from one of the 2 shortwave transmitters. We were only then using 1 shortwave transmitter on the air. So I had the crew remove the feeder cable from the front mast because it had been run all the way to the top of the front mast. I had them bring the feeder cable back down to deck level, and we wound a big coil on a plastic barrel, and it all looked very impressive. And I'd sort of matched the thing to 773 kilohertz, and everything looked good until I turned the transmitter on. And then, because of the voltages across the coil, the barrel just started to catch fire and melt. And suddenly there was a bit of panic on deck as the crew started running around with the fire extinguishers, and I think somebody started up the fire hose. And of course it was a big plastic barrel and there was a lot of smoke, and it all looked far more dramatic than it really was. But I think perhaps that's the amusing anecdote that perhaps you were thinking of. Fortunately, by the time I got to be in charge of the transmitters on the Mi Amigo, I'd actually grown a bit wiser. I'd sort of learned the hard way that you couldn't do things quite so simply and easily.
I ask, do you have any funny stories apart from transmitting the live on board jokes, practical jokes? What was it like in the 70s? Because I know you were maybe opposites with the Dutch, but you had a lot of fun.
Well, we did have lots of practical jokes, which, looking back on them with the benefit of years, are really probably not so funny now as they seemed at the time. But sadly, we would pick on people, and we had an engineer, Mike Hydrofoil, I think we called him, because we had this machine that sort of pumped the water up into the ship, and it was a hydrofoil. But some of the English people mispronounced it hydrofoil, and he was Mike Hydrofoil because he was always tinkering with us, trying to make it work. And I don't know, we were teasing him, and I can't quite what led to it, but he was obviously a rather nervous type, and at a certain point he barricaded himself in his cabin. So we thought, well, that's no fun, he's locked himself away, so we'll smoke him out. And we got a couple of vacuum cleaners, and we had dozens of cigarettes burning on the input to the vacuum cleaner, blowing cigarette smoke under the door, and we thought that'll smoke him out, and it didn't. So then, of course, we weren't to be beaten. We got some fire extinguishers of the powder type, and we aimed those under the door and let fly. And of course, the cabin was suddenly filled with all this choking powder. And again, nothing happened. And it just went deathly quiet. And, we thought, my God, we've killed him. So anyway, ultimately we got the door open and he wasn't there. He'd got the boards off his bunk bed, and he'd got some of the floorboards up underneath the cabin, and he'd gone down into the bilges of the ship, which was all oily water and muck and horror, and he'd crawled down underneath, and he'd come up sort of at a different point in the corridor, and he'd escaped. But I don't know, as I say, looking back with hindsight, these days you wouldn't really think it very funny, but it was the kind of thing that did go on.
Yeah, your neat trick, I remember, I didn't know about till it happened to me, was filling balloons with oxyacetylene.
Well, that was another thing that came into our mind. We had this, we discovered that the fun of giving a sniff of oxygen and a sniff of acetylene into a plastic bag. And then, if you were sensible, you tied a cigarette onto the end of a broom handle, and then from a safe distance, you prodded the bag, and there was a terrific bang. And the Mi Amigo had cabin hatches, which were on deck, and usually they were open to allow some fresh air into the cabin. So if you wanted to frighten the life out of somebody that was fast asleep, maybe been doing a program all night long, we'd sort of tie the plastic bag just onto the hatch, and from a safe distance we'd ignite it, and there would be a terrific bang. And it was all going further and further out of control until Mike Barrington got hold of a bin liner, a big plastic bin liner, and he filled this with gas, and he was carrying it along the deck, and just the sunlight detonated it. And of course, he was pretty well deafened, and the plastic had flayed his skin. He'd got these big welts across his chest from where the bag had disintegrated. And that rather put a stop to that kind of activity.
Well, I can remember one afternoon, Mark Jacobs was on the air doing Bach and Sistine. It was one hot summer's afternoon. We're all pretty bored, and Peter was running around looking for some evil fun to commit. And on the upper deck where the Mi Amigo studios were, there was a small hole under one of the portholes. And you'd concocted this bag trick with the cigarette on the end, and you waited for Mark to put the mic on. He was doing one of his long, laborious links about sandbanks and schoolboys and whatever. And he pushed this broom handle through under the mixer. In the middle of the link, it exploded. And all you heard on there was, F this, F that, as he legged it out of the studio, thinking there was an explosion of almighty proportions under the desk. And it blew out about 30 years of dust and muck from under that little Gates desk in there, out onto the deck, and they were chasing matches up and down as he tried to find out the perpetrator, this man.
Yeah, the first time he did it to me, I didn't know about this, and I was sat down in the Caroline studio, which had one of these hatches right above the DJ. And I was sat there, and I'd just gone into a link, and I told him the record on the slip mat, and there's this almighty bang, right? It deafened me. And I remember now the needles on the VU meter just went poof, straight over. It was really loud. But worst of all, from the balloon melting, hot plastic was dripping onto my hand and the record. I thought, I've got to be professional about this, I'll just continue. I was trying to continue to do the link, basically with my hand on fire with hot drips of plastic falling on it. And it was that hot, actually. I looked afterwards, and it had gone straight through the albums. That's how hot it was. And kept going, then let the record go and thought,
I can remember once we were up on the bridge. I think it was me and Otto, the sailor we had on the ship at the time. Now, Roger and I had been on board. It was during our 5-month stint, I think, and we were both really, really weary of this whole thing. Yeah. And we decided one night to pretend there was a tender alongside. So we went out on the deck with shovels and broom handles and banged them around and shouted a lot, then ran up to the bridge and watched as Roger came up on the deck and plonked his suitcases on the deck, looked up and down on the starboard side, nothing there. Then we ran to the other side and watched him do the same on the port side. Realised he'd been tricked, went back to bed and didn't mention it next day.
No.
You were very well gentlemanly about that.
No.
Did you know that we'd done this?
I've vague recollections.
All right.
Obviously, you began to learn after a while that when something like that happened, it was a wind-up, so, oh well, okay, back to bed.
I think the most trouble I ever got into was one day I decided to clean the bathroom.
Oh, yeah.
And Roger sort of got involved in the back end of this. Being a lazy type, I thought the best way to do it was just to sprinkle neat ammonia everywhere. Into the toilet, into the shower rooms, and I shut the door, shut the porthole, and forgot. And the cook on the ship at the time, probably about half an hour later, decided to go for a leak. Went in, and as soon as he opened the door, drew breath. And it threw him onto the floor, and he was gasping for breath. He came running into the mess room where I was sitting with my legs up watching Pebble Mill at 1 or something. And he asked who was responsible for this nonsense. I said nothing. And I think Roger walked in shortly afterwards.
Well, I went to see what all the fuss was about. Because he closed the door again when he come out. I went to see what all the fuss was about. He was right, because I opened the door, went in, and he just took your breath away.
And he came into the mess room, and I think the finger was pointed at me, and I couldn't get out of it, so I apologised. And he said, well, profusely, as I legged it, so I thought he was going to hit me. And he said, as soon as he got on shore leave, I was to be prosecuted for attempted murder. And he wouldn't cook for me for days. I just had to make my own sandwiches. Silly thing. Yeah.
Something of practical jokes. Are you able to tell us what happened during that infamous broadcast with Samantha? You and Mark Jacobs in the studio?
Oh,
yes.
I think maybe this is a question for another time, quite frankly.
I think the recording of it's well heard. But yes, it was alcohol induced, I'm afraid to say.
The thing about working, I mean, I'm sure it's the same on all offshore stations. I only worked on Caroline. But the thing about an offshore radio station is that you're there for one reason, and that reason is your program. And your focus is on your program. But then when you're off the air, as Peter was saying, there's always so much to do. Even, I mean, when I first joined, I caught the tail end of having a crew. There was a sailor and, but that kind of phased out. By the time I finished, there was no crew. So we were doing programs and we were crewing as well. So you were pretty tired and you needed something. And it's very easy to forget that in those days we didn't have video recorders or mobile phones or the internet or whatever. We, as I said somewhere, we had ourselves some magazines.
Let's not talk about them.
You lot might have done, I didn't.
No. We had ourselves and some magazines, and that was it. So you had to find ways of entertaining yourself. Now, the strange thing is, I mean, Stuart's still involved with commercial radio. You're kind of vaguely involved with commercial radio.
Yes, on the engineering side, rather than behind the microphone.
The strange thing is, I mean, we've mentioned this before. You go into radio stations nowadays, and there is no element of fun. And I don't mean on the air, I mean off the air. And it culminated, going slightly off topic, but I'll come back on again. One radio station that I worked for, we received a memo. And it said, it has been noted that several on-air staff are in the building at times other than their allotted air shifts. It should be remembered that radio station business hours are 8:30 till 5:30, Monday to Friday, and 9 till 12 on a Saturday. If you wish to be in the building at times other than your allotted air shift, you should seek the permission of your line manager. Now, I remember that verbatim because it shocked me so much. That's what commercial radio in Great Britain is doing. The idea of doing anything like Peter's just suggested, or Roger or Stuart, forget it. I mean, you talk about the guy wanting to do you for criminal damage or whatever. I mean, the whole idea of, forgive the expression, relieving yourself, and I mean that in its strictest sense, by actually getting some fun and banter is It just doesn't happen anymore. And as I say, I'm sure it happened on all the offshore stations. I mean, we needed to do it, otherwise we'd just go mad.
And the other thing, we were able to listen to everyone else's programs. It was beamed about the ship, we had it on in the cabin, so we heard what everyone else was doing. We understood their reason for being there, from the way they behaved on the air. We understood their music choices, and we could adapt, and we all worked so well together. We ate, slept, and did everything.
The amazing thing outside of the actual programs was that Caroline brought together people from lots of different experiences. Geographically, I mean, this guy was from this place called Birmingham, which I'd never heard of. Well, I mean, I'd vaguely heard of it, but, you know, and he was from Kent, and I was from London, and we were all together. Some of us went to public school, some of us went to state school, some of us didn't go to school, some of us were absolutely raving mad. Hi, Mike.
Raving what?
Why are you looking at me?
And the thing was, we had to work together. You know, I mean, the average, when I was involved, the average was a 6-week stint on. In reality, it was sort of 7-8 weeks that you spent on board. You had to live together. And, you know, there are stories of people having huge arguments, huge rows. Unlike on shore, you couldn't walk away, you had to get it resolved, because the next day you would see that person and you would have to live with that person. It had to get resolved. So all sorts of stuff got done, but the practical joke stuff was just vital, I'd say. I mean, I don't know.
Yeah, because you got to remember, from the DJ's point of view, when you were on board for, 6, 7, 8 weeks at a time, it did start sometimes to get a little bit of a drudge at times. You enjoyed the programs, but sometimes, you thought there was more to life. And you'd notice in some of the DJs, they'd arrive for their program later and later, and they'd be in there 2 seconds to the top of the hour. So we devised one little scheme. I think we got you with it one time, Nigel. Was that as you were getting towards the end of the program, you used to start taking everything out of the studio, all the records. You'd start taking out and put them in the library, because the way it was, we had the library and then the studio next to it. And there was a certain number of albums were kept in the studio, but everything else in the library. But during the last half hour of your program, you'd gradually take every album out of the studio and everything that could be played out of the studio. And then the unwitting DJ would come in to do his program. He'd say, I've queued up your first track for you. Take off the one that was playing, leave the studio, and take the door handle with you as you went out. Leaving the girl to come on after you with one record and a 3-hour program and no way to get out the studio unless he... And I think actually once, I think it was you who climbed out the top hatch, wasn't it?
Oh yes, I shimmied up a sheet or something, got out.
Yeah, I think somebody did actually get out to the top one time.
We're kind of running out of time on this part, so if we've got a question for Martin Fisher and a question for Mike Barrington, then we'll wrap it up.
Yeah, hi guys. Clive Roylance here with a group from Ireland. We're of a similar age, and as kids, I suppose we listened a lot during the 70s. And one thing we recalled talking about recently was the number system you used of code numbers. And we were debating what those were, what they meant. I wonder if you could explain a bit about the number system and also what the system was you had at the other end. I mean, who was taking note of those numbers and who was acting on them?
I've still got the code listed at home.
Yeah, could you explain a bit about it, please?
You've gone it.
Well, they were instigated.
Let Mark.
Oh, sorry, yeah. Sorry.
Well, as I'm sure you can possibly guess, in those days, communication with land wasn't particularly easy. And so we had this system of numbers that basically we had a list on the ship and there was another list on land, which obviously had the same items. Whatever the number was, it referred to, say, we had a problem with a generator or a problem with a transmitter, or please send us some food or water, whatever we were short of, there would be a number to correlate to the item we required. And so at a certain time, was it about 8 o'clock in the evening, we used to, on the end of the weather forecast, just add the list of numbers of the items that we were short of, and or any little emergencies that needed.
Yeah, just to point out that the reason that we used a code list was that we didn't want the authorities to realise what items we were short of, or possibly that we had a real problem on the ship, because we were battling against the Marine Offences Law in England and a similar law in Holland. So we didn't want to announce to the world that we were, 2 days, running of fuel, or that we were out of water or out of food. We had to sort of code the messages so that some of them were very trivial. We've run out of bread, we've run out of marmalade, but some of them were really serious. We've got an anchor chain broken, we've got no fuel, we're out of water. Just to let you continue, but just to point that out, the reason that we used codes and the reason there was a code list is because we had to basically keep the knowledge of how serious these problems were between ourselves.
Just a bit intrigued though as to how you managed to do that with such a small number of numbers. I mean, even on the night the ship sank, you were reading out a very few numbers.
Well, I mean, some of them are more serious numbers, said a whole lot, like ship drifting out of control, number 99 or whatever it might have been. I mean, you didn't have to have a lot of other code numbers with that. You had a panic situation.
I remember very, very briefly we changed the system of code numbers. The new code list was sent to the ship, but not sent to land. So one afternoon, listening to some emergency codes in the middle of I think it was weekend, Sunday afternoon, the ship was drifting, as Peter was saying, out of control, and we've run short of matches, was what it translated as.
And of course, some of the numbers didn't actually mean anything particularly, but you had to keep the numbers going whether nothing was going wrong or not. Otherwise, it was going to be a bit obvious that if there were suddenly numbers, something was happening. So
we could also make complete sentences up, couldn't we?
So-
We could actually make complete sentences up because all the lists were absolutely identical. I think one of the numbers, Peter, was something like 100, wasn't it? Main engine not working, which you hadn't done for years. But you could take syllables from that and actually piece the whole thing together. And all the lists were identical. The trouble is everybody had a list, didn't they? I think we've all still got a copy, haven't we?
I think so, yeah.
Some weeks ago, several people wondered who holds the record for the longest stint on the Me Amigo. And Art Roberts suggested it was Tony Allen, or was it Peter Chicago? Or even
No, not me. No, it was Tony.
Or Mike Barrington, maybe.
I believe Tony Allen did have that record.
Yeah.
What did you do, Mike? How long were you on there in one stint?
On the Me Amigo, I'm not sure. I know we went without food for months and months or weeks.
Yeah, we all did that.
But that was when we were going to eat Frank. Do you remember?
Yeah.
Tony Allen and I concocted a plan that we were going to eat somebody because it was getting desperate, and we'd been off the air for months, and we decided that Johnny he was a big chap, but he never washed, and the next alternative was Frank or Roger Mathews, whatever. But unfortunately, he heard us plotting this plan in the back cabin. Went and hid. We didn't see him for weeks on end, or days on end, as it was.
That was a strange period. I mean, people remember the station when it was off the air, but there was times when it was off the air for a few months. An awful lot was still going on out there, but nobody really remembers. And that period in particular, at one stage, everything was just running out. There'd been no tenders. And we ended up, didn't we? We had a sack of rice and some OXO cubes. And that was it.
And some sardines.
No, we had the sardines. I ate the sardines with Owen.
Yeah, we went through the sardines. These sardines had been on since 1972 or something. Seriously, and these tins in the food store.
I lived on brown Windsor soup for about 2 months out there.
Really?
I think when Roger was there, when we did our 5-month trip out there, running the thing 24 hours a day with 2 of us, until that infamous time when we thought, how can we get out of this? And I found the Motown story.
That's right.
And we ran it because there were no gaps between the tracks. And when I got home, I was sacked. Then I was back in 2 weeks anyway. So.
That's right. I mean, it was pretty horrendous at times. But I got to admit, I sat down. We had Owen, the Irish engineer, out there at the time. We sat down for breakfast and had the last tin of sardines for breakfast between us in the studio. Then it was down to the rice and the gravy browning or OXO, whatever it was.
I remember the rice flavoured with pickled onions.
Amazing what you can do with rice when you're desperate.
Just wondered if there are any bloopers which disc jockeys may have remembered playing inappropriate records for inappropriate people.
I don't think we bothered about that at the time. I don't think we knew. We didn't care.
I do remember when Johnny Jason first came out to the boat, and he was playing. Who was it who recorded "You're Breaking My Heart"? So fuck you.
Harry Nilsson.
Harry Nilsson. That was the track, and Johnny played this track. And when it came to your breaking my heart, so fuck you, he said, "Oh my gosh, I had no idea it was like that." And he took the record off, and he was fumbling, and he didn't have another record queued up. And he'd come straight from Australian radio, where of course to play that was an absolute, beyond the pale, taken off the air, sacked. So I think that was probably the biggest blooper, the biggest reaction we had to anybody playing an inappropriate record.
Sorry. I think one song that still gets asked for, even these days, that we championed in the 70s, She Moved the Dishes First,
Yeah.
which I played a few Saturdays ago on the satellite.
Yeah.
Goodness me, did I get some abusive emails.
Yeah, I heard about
How
that.
dare you play this in the middle of the afternoon? But so what?
Yeah.
Caroline's supposed to be pushing boundaries.
We were probably the only radio station that ever played that track.
It's a great song.
I know.
But yeah. Oh, the Winker song. Who was that by?
If the tender has arrived, we've got another crew coming on now. So.
Goedemiddag, dames en heren. Tot ziens.
Yes, thank you very much.
I'll leave you to it.